Who's that? Somebody said hello. No, she's on the call, but she's muted. All right, so I'm going to try to share my screen. Uh-oh. Oh, Suzanne, I need.
You should, oh, okay, let me make host.
Maybe actually you should like watch the screen. I'll just look this way and this way. Okay. So let's see. Share screen. Okay. Oops, accidentally. Oh, it should be fine. Can you guys see it okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So somebody's here. Anyway, I'm just going. All right, so today we're going to talk about resource guarding, and we're not going to talk about in the sense of like figuring out whether in a case there's resource guarding going on. I'm already assuming that you know, although we'll talk a little bit about what it looks like, but not very much. I'm just going to talk about more like the management of the problem behavior and then protocols that you can use to help resolve the behavior. Okay, so when this thing is happening, that's what you're supposed to press, right? Okay. Okay, so the goals of today's talk are to just kind of define what resource guarding is, to the extent that is useful for this presentation, and the types of protocols that we use in the presentation. So people can say a whole bunch of things of resource guarding. I'll tell you what I mean when I say resource guarding. Also, we'll talk about different management techniques, which is a really big deal with resource guarding, and then some exercises that directly work with the behavior. Okay, so what is resource guarding? Patricia McConnell says in her blog, which I highly recommend, behavior that discourages another to take or get too close to an object or valued area in a dog's possession. So that's pretty clear, and I just feel like that resource guarding behaviors are agonistic behaviors. So those are behaviors that have something to do with fighting or conflict that dogs show when they're approached, when they're in the possession of an item of value. So there are some other things that people might call resource guarding that don't fit into this description. So that's why I wanted to make clear what we're talking about today. This behavior is normal for dogs. This is something that, you know, if a dog did that, I would say that's very species appropriate. I would not say, oh my God, this is an abnormal dog. Your dog needs medications just because they're resource guarding. And Jean Donaldson talks a lot about this in Mine. So if you haven't read Mine and you're really interested in resource guarding, we have it at the shelter, so you can borrow it. Do let me know. We have all these behavior books that we like to lend to people to share the knowledge, so just ask. It's not something that has anything to really do with status. So a lot of people think that when a dog is guarding something, that they're like, I'm your boss, I'm trying to like control your life. It goes along with, you know, I want to walk out the door first, or I want to, I don't know, I'm not very good at the alpha dog stuff because I don't practice it. But if a dog is guarding stuff and not wanting you to come near their stuff, it's not necessarily because they want to, you know, or it's not because they want to be your boss. There's a very clear, so over the years, this is something, one of those things that I've observed over the years, and then nobody told me about this, but this is definitely appears to be the case, is that there's a very big element of fear in guarding, or, you know, conversely, trust. So if a dog trusts you, if they have that predisposed, if they have that predisposition towards guarding and they trust you, then it's less likely that they'll show that behavior. But if they don't, if they fear you, even the slightest bit, so you might not kind of see it all the time on a day-to-day basis, they might be more likely to guard. And what this means is that if you see guarding, between a dog and a person or two dogs, when they first meet each other, then over time, if you participate in trust building activities, or if the dog who is not trusted just is very good at building the trust of another dog, or some people are just naturally good at building trust, then that behavior can lessen over time. And I've seen this happen. It just kind of spontaneously goes away. I can tell you a lot of anecdotes about that, but that'll take up all of our time. And one other thing that people think about resource guarding, which not necessarily the case, is it's not driven by an abundancy or scarcity of resources. So like if a dog guards food, it's not because they were starved on the street. Like I always hear this. I always, when we used to use resource guarding tests in our behavior evaluations, I used to hear all the time people say, "Oh, of course that dog guards. They're so skinny. They just haven't had anything to eat, and they're so hungry." But at the same time, you'll see a lot of fat, very fulfilled, nutritionally dog guard food. So it's not necessarily because of an abundance or scarcity of resources. It's really important to know. So do you guys have any questions about what resource guarding is before we go on? Okay, so it could the resources could be anything. It could be like food or two things, toys. It could be people. It could be attention. Can you see from there? Okay. So, but let's talk about, from the point of view of solving a behavior problem, let's talk about what's really happening when a dog guards. And I guess cats can guard too, sure. We should acknowledge that. And people. Okay, so what's happening? So a dog is in a situation where they have something that they're interested in, their resource, and the human or the other dog comes near them, and at a certain proximity, the dog shows this agonistic behavior, whatever it is. It can be some very subtle behavior. Like if you look at this picture that I've got here with this, I don't know, can I see my arrow? But you can see that the dog is quite tense. It's not a video, but you can see the stillness. And if you look at where the dog is looking, they're kind of looking over to the side, not necessarily at their bone. It's kind of a classic guarding posture, but it's not this growling, snarling. That stuff, doesn't necessarily have to happen. And then something else happens after. So either the human recognizes those threats and they back off, or they say no, or something happens. It's usually something very unpleasant. So what's driving the behavior? What do you guys, you tell me, what do you think? Because there's, I can think of it in two different ways. I can think of two different things happening. What's happening here? Like, let's talk about it from like an operant point of view, or like a classical conditioning point of view. What's going on? There's a part where Emery feels guilty about this. What do you guys think?
When you're talking about resource guarding, the first thing that comes to mind is Nala, she first got here. And like what you're saying, like Harris now, like she'll just like literally bring stuff and put it in.
Sure.
Her, but she doesn't do that with everybody.
So what do you think, why do you think, or what do you think was happening when she did that before?
She doesn't have a relationship built up at the very beginning. Like she didn't have a relationship with anybody, so she felt the need that she was
Yeah, I mean, like, I wouldn't think so deeply into it, but yeah, the relationship thing is important because if you don't have a trusting relationship, and if she didn't feel comfortable with us, and we don't know her history, somebody, you know, what happens when dogs pick up stuff like, I don't know, like they go in the trash, it's the trash and stuff, like a pizza crust outside, or you know, just stuff they're not supposed to have. Like my dogs eat crayons, and I have kids, right? So what happens? The person just rushes over to them, and then they're like, "No, drop it, leave it." It's a huge hullabaloo, and so the dog associates the person coming up to them with this really scary thing. So the scary event. So if you could say that maybe Nala, not knowing us, and you know we're potential threats, humans might have done this to her in the past, and then there's the whole setup, there's the whole scenario where she's got that item, she's not sure if it's okay to have the item, she's not sure if we're dangerous, we're going to come up to her. So that's one thing. There's a conditioned emotional response if you think about it from that approach, right? But also there's an operant, you know, side to it too. She might think, well, if I put on this display, they might, you know, back away or be less likely to take it from me. So there's a couple different things going on. And I think it's rarely just one or the other. I think it's more like a combination of the two. Like it probably started, you know, you can make up a story. Like it started when the dog had something they weren't supposed to have, and then they did a little warning growl, and the person was like, "Oh no, my dog's aggressive," and then it got crazy. Like you can imagine that happening. I'm telling you this, it's really important to kind of accept the emotional part of resource guarding, because it's really important in changing. That's the problem there, that kind of emotionally charged conflict, and that's the thing we have to heal. You know, when we see owners and their canine companions, you know, fighting over the resource, we're gonna try to heal that and change the feeling of that encounter. The reason I say that is I'm thinking back to when my first resource guarding case that I saw, which is also one of the worst cases that I ever saw, and I've probably told you all about this before. It was a couple from Columbia University. They were both professors of psychology. So you can imagine the tremendous amount of pressure on me because I was just a novice dog trainer at the time. And their dog was biting them like every week pretty severely over things like banana peels or like trash at the dog park. Um, and, uh, and, you know, of course we did the Whatcha Got There, we did the exercises that we always do, but the biggest part of the treatment that led to their success was really in coaching one of the moms, the one who got bitten the most, in how to approach the dog when she had something of value. Because before, when I came to them, she was doing the whole, no, drop it, leave it. It was a whole big deal. And then she got bitten like every time. And so we had to find another way that wasn't going to be quite so confrontational. So that's why that's so important to me. That's like some trust breaking stuff happening there, right? That's, you know, that's scary. Okay, so let's talk about management now that we all know what's going on there with resource guarding. We know like the, you know, two different facets about this behavior. So how do we manage things? So super simple recommendation, but you know, people also not good at the simple stuff too, which is picking up stuff, right? Like pick up those crayons. You know, pick up those crayons. I don't have a guarding issue, but I don't like it when my dogs poop out crayons. And I have a real trouble making sure that the crayons are up off the floor. And it's the same thing for anybody who's dealing with the resource guarding. You know, make sure that feedings happen in a safe spot, in a crate, or in the dog's special room where, you know, you're not going to bother them, and your kids aren't going to bother them, and the other dogs aren't going to bother them. Make sure that you only give the dog, if they guard toys, you're only going to give them toys in specific situations where you're just aware that they have the toy, and you're going to be very cognizant about the way you interact with them. And otherwise, you're not going to just leave toys all over your house. You're not going to have free access to toys, you know, whenever they want, just because there's that danger. Also, the same thing with chews. You know, you're going to give them chews at a specific place. It could be a specific time too. That just keeps you from accidentally coming upon your dog when they have that, you know, that I'm thinking about a deer antler, something that lasts a really long time, and you just give it to the dog, you forget about it, it ends up, you know, on your couch, and then you sit down with your dog. So just, you know, just be aware of where all these items are. And then also affection. You know, we always say at the shelter when we've got our play dates, you know, be careful when you're doling out your affection, that you don't risk that you're giving one dog affection when the other one's going to approach you. Okay, so let's talk about this using proper trading, like with these Columbia University professors. This was more than half of the problem. So what do you do? I have people practice trading exercises so that at the time that they do come upon their dog and they're, you know, into something that is not appropriate, that they know what to do, because at the moment people just don't know what to do. It's a very emotional experience for people and for the dog. So the trading game that I have is something called breadcrumbs. So it's like using the breadcrumbs to lure the dog away. And it sounds simple, but it's very actually difficult to coach people to do. Let's see, here's the video. There's Anne. Okay, so I want to say that breadcrumbs are difficult because you're luring the dog away from something that they don't want to move away from. And also, you know, so the problem is that people tend to, they don't plan it out. They kind of step away from the item and then they have to race the dog back to the item. Or frequently dogs learn that they learn not to participate in this game because the person has like one little breadcrumb and they try to lure them and it ends up not being worth it. So you have to make it worth it for them. So my tips are to stay near the resource. So like you kind of see where the item is. In this case, it's a rawhide. And we want Anne to stand by the rawhide, you know, not so close as to get over threshold. So you don't want to see any signs of resource guarding. You want to be, you know, far enough away that the dog looks very comfortable. And then you're going to drop a high value food item on the dog's head, like on top of their head, as long as they're not too sensitive for that. On top of the head, another on top of the head, then right next to them, so they don't even have to take a step, again right next to them, and then chuck a whole handful of treats. And you're gonna, of course, it's gonna be further and further away, and the distance in between each treat is really determined by the dog. So if the dog is very reluctant to leave the item, you're gonna have your treats really close together. If you practice this many times and the dog will be more fluent at leaving the item, then you can actually toss treats pretty far away. When I'm coaching caregivers, I'm very specific about what I want them to do, and I do have them practice this many, many times before I let them leave the first time. So let's watch Anne do it. I think she does a fabulous job. Thank you, Anne. Oh, it's me doing it first. So on the head, next to him, and then a handful. Okay, and see how my feet are right close to the bowl there. And this is I think this is an empty bowl to start with. So we want a very low stakes item. Right there, right on top of him, next to him, and then a bunch. So Anne has to stay really close to the bowl and she's keeping an eye on him. Right, so you don't want to practice. You don't want to practice this first with your caregivers with something like a rawhide or something that's potentially higher value. So I always have them practice with something that the dog probably would leave anyway. Oh, so here's the rawhide. And we're talking about having a plan, right? Having a plan when you approach. So don't just run up there and toss a bunch of treats at the dog. You have a plan about where you're going to be and where the dog's going to go. Okay. Okay, so here's some troubleshooting. So this can go wrong. How do I get out of this? It's not working. Oh, it did work. Okay. Okay, so things can go wrong. So I just took a couple clips where things weren't just so ideal. The first one is that people have a tendency to like follow the dogs as they're tossing the treat. So they drop the treat, take a couple steps, drop the treat, and they're going, and pretty soon they realize that they're as far away from the rawhide as the dog is, and then they have to race the dog back, and there's that whole kind of, again, that feeling of contention that you want to avoid. So you want to stay by the treat. So let's see, I think this is what happened here. And the other one is keeping an eye on the dog too, to see that they're really busy with the treats when you do take away the resource. Aha, so this is racing back to the treat, right? So let's just watch that really quickly again, because you can see that when she's dropped those last treats that he looks at her, so you don't want that. And she's also stepping away, right? So stepping away is also. Yeah. Oh no, this was the other one. Oh, I guess I didn't rewind it. Let's watch them both again. All right, here, look, he's looking, right? So you want to keep your eye on the dog to make sure that they're busy with the treats when you reach over.
Would you just, if they are checking with you like that, would you just keep moving them farther with the treats?
Yeah, or not even farther, but just like toss a bunch of treats and just wait until they're interested. And also notice that every time we take the item away, we're giving it back too. So it's like, you know, it's a very positive experience for the dog. It's a win-win situation. They relinquish the item, they get some food treats, and they get the item back. Okay, so we're going to start talking about the counter conditioning aspect. So changing the way that the dog feels about you or whoever is the target. So if it's, you know, whoever they're guarding against, and how that affects the resource guarding. So we talked a bit about that already. It's something that's super worth your time. It's not just for dogs who are just overtly fearful. It's for lots of dogs. How many times have you seen caregivers and their dog, and they seem quite happy as they walk into the room, but then when they start interacting directly, you can see that the dog is like, oh, you know, that person keeps, like, you know, it reminds me of one time when I was doing a CGC class, and we were teaching the dogs to come when called, and a dog would come really well to the person, to his caregiver when she calls him, but then, you know, every time he came, he would get the treat, but also she would be like, good boy, good boy. And so he would cringe because he was ready for that. And also kind of slow down towards the end of the recall. But they had a good relationship. I think that there was just a misunderstanding about what was a reward for that dog. So what does it mean to build trust? I'm sure you guys have ideas, and we can talk about this later because I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it. But it's about, you know, understanding your dog, what your dog likes and dislikes. So, you know, become fluent in dog. Read as many texts as you can. Go to like play group. Go to the dog park and watch dogs interact. I have a bunch of books that I could recommend to you guys, or you can borrow from the shelter. But, you know, learn about that, and then show that to caregivers, because caregivers are often unable to read their own dogs, and that will help you be consistently positive, consistently safe for your dogs. Really avoid compulsive training. So what I mean by that is any kind of training that uses fear, even a slightest bit of fear, even just telling your dogs off by saying no, that sort of thing. Avoid that. Of course, shock collars and prong collars and anything that might hurt your dog, anything that startles your dog, because that makes you, you know, either less predictable or predictably scared. And that makes this kind of situation worse, the situation that is kind of the root of resource guarding. And we know now there's a lot of evidence that shows that compulsive training is related to high stress relationships between dogs and people. So dogs start to associate their caregivers with that training, resulting in elevated cortisol levels. We know that when people use compulsive training with their dogs, that the dogs see that person and also feel the stress of their training. And incorporate some choice, not just in your training, but in your daily life, about, you know, where they get to rest, what, you know, how you interact with them, you know, what you play, how you pet them. So we can talk about this another time, but it's so important. It's a huge facet of resource guarding, is this kind of distrust. Okay. So here's another kind of, it's a trust building exercise, but it also counter conditions taking items away. So it teaches dogs to be optimistic about when you take things away from them. So I forgot to mention that Chance does have a history of resource guarding. He's a young guy, but you know, so maybe not a lot of experience, just a few months of experience. But he used to growl and snap at his foster every single day. And he's guarded things like empty water bowls or puddles of water, food, chew items, and toys, and affection. So in this exercise, I'm doing this something called refills. I call it refills because I'm taking a rawhide away from him and I'm refilling it with some dog food and I make it tastier. So every time I take the rawhide away, I add more yummy stuff and it gets better each time. So let's watch it. You get an idea of what I'm doing. So I don't relinquish the rawhide just yet. He's not quite ready. You know, this is our first session doing it.
You're just letting him like mouth at it.
Yeah, I'm letting him chew it. And then I say refills to predict that me taking it away. And then I put some more food on it and then I give it back to him.
That's pretty fun.
It is fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so simple.
I feel like that would be like mechanically easier than the first one for like people to start with.
Yeah, but the thing is that the first exercise is key because that's where all the bad stuff happens.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so cute. He's so smart. It only took him one time to get it.
I just like having trouble with his walking.
Okay. So this goes on for a bit, but do you have any questions about it?
What if he doesn't want to let go of the rawhide when you say refills?
You can trade with something like you can trade with some, some of the canned food. But it's really, I'll show you too here. This is the same thing. I think you get it, but we can look at it later if you want. Similarly, here's tug. So I had never tugged with Chance before, so this is our first session. And it's a similar thing. So if I felt like Chance wasn't going to relinquish the tug, I could have traded him for something higher value. Like I could have showed him another toy or showed him some treats, and when he dropped it, I could reward him that way. But in this case, I was playing with him, and then I would just kind of turn off and stop playing and just wait for him to automatically offer the behavior, which is letting go. And when he let go, I gave it back to him. So he just learns that, relinquishing stuff to me is not a bad thing because it, results in this fun outcome. He's like, wait, can I? So here, I don't need it to be on cue here. I just want him to automatically let it go and for me to give it back to him. If you put it on cue, that's cool too.
Are you marking it when he lets?
Yeah, I'm marking it by saying yes when he lets go. I know it's hard to hear, huh? I love playing tug with dogs. It's not bad for his first time. All right. Okay, so that was just a couple exercises for counter conditioning taking away. So here's kind of the most famous exercise that we do about resource guarding, which is Whatcha Got There. It's counter conditioning him to associate my approach when he's got the bowl with, adding something nice. So basically, I think, yeah, so here's an empty bowl. So he's not likely, well, actually he guarded an empty bowl. I was gonna say he's not likely to guard it, but he's guarded empty bowls before, so never mind. And I'm just walking up to him while he's near the bowl, and just putting a treat in the bowl. I'm trying to put a treat in the bowl. I probably miss a few times, but. So he doesn't have to do anything. I'm just going up to him and giving him the treat. He can, you know, it's not contingent on his behavior.
Do you want to miss the Do you want to miss the
No, he's begging for stuff outside.
Did you pick up the food? It doesn't make out with it. Okay, well, I'll pick it up then. Because I don't want him spreading food all over the place.
He's not touching it.
Oh, and you see here that even though there's nothing in the bowl, just to stay in the habit, I do the trait, like you know, I'm safe about how I get the bowl from him. So even if you're, you know, like 99% sure that the dog is not going to guard that item, just be in the habit of doing that so that you're more predictable and it's just safer for you. You know, if you always do the same thing every time, here comes Pam. All right, if you always do the same thing, then you're less likely to, you know, just accidentally forget and do something else. Okay, so here's the next step. Okay, so here's the next step. So we're gonna, you see,
Oh, sorry.
there's a dog on me, you can't see it. All right, so the next step is we're gonna start using higher value items. In this case, it's kibble. And then we're gonna start seeing an operant response. So in the beginning, I'm just coming up to him and giving him some food. And then over time, he starts automatically looking at me when I come up to him. What's that called? It's something we've talked about before. It's auto shaping, right? It's auto shaping. So, you know, we're just pairing two stimuli at first. So 2 events, like he's got the food, and I come up to him, and then eventually he starts associating my approach with the food. So he starts to offer natural behaviors that he, you know, these unconditioned responses to food, which is looking up. And then he starts as an operant behavior, looking at me so that I can reinforce that. So I mark and reward it. So here we go. So we're gonna start with just the pure classical conditioning, I think. Good, yeah, so he's just eating that stuff. He's not looking up at me yet. Oh, he started looking up.
So one thing I noticed when we were doing this exercise was that before he started looking up at Melissa, his tail started wagging faster when she approached. And I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and it could be because, so, I mean, I think it was because Chance was like, oh, here she's coming with something good, but also it could be, you know, just before a dog actually guards something, if they're getting more aroused, they can wag their tail more, so I wouldn't necessarily take it to mean a good thing. But just because I kind of know Chance a little bit and worked with him a little bit, I feel like he was already kind of anticipating that something good was going to happen. But you can't really count on the tail wag. So I think he's now been looking up. So once he starts looking up, then you say yes and reinforce the behavior. But at the same time, you can't always predict, if they're going to continue looking up every time. So if on attempt 1 through 5, he looked up at me, I would say yes and give him a treat. But in attempt 6 and 7, if he didn't look up at me, I would still just give him a treat, right? I'm not going to wait. I'm not going to prompt him in any way. I'm just going to just give him the treat right away. Okay, so here's the next step. So once he's reliably showing this response, and I can, mark and reward it. He's consistently looking up at me, maybe 90% of the time, close to 100%. Then I'm going to start putting the behavior on cue. So I'm going to say, first I'm going to notice that I'm approaching him from a distance, right? That helps him have time to notice that I'm coming up to him. So I'm approaching from, 6 feet away or so. I'm going to say, "Whatcha got there" first. Then I'm going to start approaching. And when he looks up, I'm going to say yes. So I'm marking looking up. He doesn't necessarily have to drop the item. He just has to look up at me.
Pete?
You can't answer, yeah.
I didn't see it.
Yeah, you put on the rug. What's the rug? Oh, I want to go to the street.
Okay, so we started with kibble, and now we've moved on to a rawhide. You notice how he's orienting closer to me now? So cute. Okay. So in that very last one, you could see that when I picked up the rawhide, I'm really keeping an eye on him to make sure that he's not going to turn back and, race me to the rawhide. Okay, so here's the next step. So you're going to want to kind of chain his response to your approach into a behavior where he actually moves away from the item. So, like looking up is great, but we want him to also get used to dropping the item and coming with me away from the item, right? Or moving away from the item. So he already knows touch, so that's something that we've trained. And I've also trained him touch and with a toss. So your reinforcer is at a distance, and he learns to move away. So I trained him to touch my hand, and I would say yes, and then I would toss his treat so that he would collect it from a distance. So he's already used to that behavior. And I just chained it together by doing the Whatcha Got There exercise. And without rewarding him, I would say right away, I would say touch instead, and then toss the treat. So there was only 2 reps here. I'll just play it over again so you can see it. This is all really cool because he did this in just one day. And it really didn't take long, right, Anne? I don't know if we were working very long at this.
I think it was somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes.
Yeah, and you know, so it's a very simple exercise and it's a fun exercise. That is the key, right? It's always fun when people come up to you and you've got stuff that you want. One day I'll figure out how to do this. Okay. So now Chance does this in the living room. It's important to kind of take him to different places and practice it because the guarding can happen anywhere. And usually the guarding is not going to happen in their training facility. It's going to go happen at home with the people. So you want to make sure that the people, the caregivers are practicing this at home. This is great with remote consults because you can actually see them do it at home. And I highly recommend having people take logs of every time, logs are so great because it just, you can see right away when somebody's filled it out. And at the end of the day, if they haven't done it, you can say, hey, I didn't catch your log for today. Did you have time to practice your what you got there? It's something that you might want to coach people to train on walks, in places where your dog might be likely to encounter some of these items that you don't want them to have, like the pizza crossing. So here, oh wait, wait a second. So this is a video of Adelie doing what you got there with Nala in the front yard. So we didn't originally teach the behavior in the front yard. So this is part of her proofing or generalization. And it's also with an item that we didn't do a lot of training with, like formal training. It's with a stick. So I forgot to mention that too. It's not just, your location and situation. It's also the items. You want them to generalize that what you got there works for all sorts of items.
What you got there? Yes, good job. Good job, Mama. Do this. Do this. Get it. Come on. What you got there? Yes, good job.
You can see we chained, instead of touch, we chained in a stick, but also the toss away. So that was really cool. She could do that anywhere. Actually, here's another cool video with Nala. So in this case, I wanted to bring up the maintenance phase because it's really easy. I think that, at the ASPCA, to work on food guarding, it took us an average of, I think, 23 to 28 training sessions. So that's actually not very many. That to get to the point where, the dog did not show any signs of resource guarding. So, these animals were worked every day and multiple times a day, but at least every day. So that's, shorter than a month when that dog came to us with resource guarding, and then they left the facility not showing any signs of resource guarding. But the problem is that you can't ever say that these behaviors are really cured. Like, once the dog has a history of resource guarding, it's really important for caregivers to remember that and continue training every once in a while these, with these exercises, but also just be very cognizant of the fact that the dog has a history of this potentially dangerous behavior. And I'm just going to tell you a story about it. I know that stories can take so much time, but there was this cute little pug that was adopted from us at the ASPCA, and we did a lot of resource guarding work with him. And he, kind of reached the end. We'd like work with him with all sorts of items, like starting with the empty bowl, then the kibble with with wet food in it, then like rawhide, and then rawhide, and then like a new rawhide, and then a rawhide that was all chewed up, and then a rawhide with like peanut butter on it, and a rawhide with dog food on it. Anyway, we did it with all sorts of items. We, you know, had him generalize. We had, you know, various rooms around the shelter, and we worked outside with him. And then he got adopted, and he lived very happily with those people. But then, then years later, the owner, they were eating, and he dropped a steak bone on the floor and just absentmindedly went to reach for it, and the dog bit him, you know, in the face pretty severely. So it just goes to show that, you know, even though you worked on the dog and you have this good working relationship around resources in their possession, it's really important to remember that in the maintenance phase. Always remember that this is the history of the dog, and always continue working on that, because it's so easy to forget. And your dog is now a normal dog, and you go on living a normal carefree life with the dog, and then down the road the behavior rears its ugly head again. So so this behavior was, you know, I don't know if Katie's on our call here, but we were working on a behavior, I think, for a photo shoot. We were not working on Whatcha Got There, and we kind of just put the hot dogs up on the cat tree. Like, we didn't even think that she would guard them, because she, you know, at that point hadn't been guarding things for a while. Luckily, we're both pretty, you know, experienced trainers. So when she did go to grab the hot dog bag, you know, we did the right thing at that time, which is we used Whatcha Got There.
Nice. Oh, her mouth was on the hot dog bag. Nice. Oh, her mouth.
Yeah, that was just repeating it. So she was just, you know, she was just about to take those hot dogs, and, you know, we had practiced. I don't know about Katie, maybe she's just amazing, but I know that I just practiced Whatcha Got There so much that that's my first thing that I say, instead of like kind of flying into a panic like a lot of things. So the training is, you know, as much for the handler as it is for the dog to like just have that reflex to just say Whatcha Got There right away. Okay. Okay, still no. Okay, so here's just kind of a summary of what we talked about today. So the first thing is, when you're encountering a resource guarding case, you know, think about what the potential antecedents are, and limit the dog's access to those items that they've shown a history of guarding. You want to also really, you yourself or the caregivers that you're working with, really encourage them to learn about what the dog looks like when they're guarding, because people just don't notice those subtle signs until it's too late. And, you know, and drill into the people other ways of approaching their dog when the dog has something that they shouldn't have. And I also should add there to encourage trust building exercises, because you usually in the cases where you see resource guarding, there are, you know, the human is doing trust breaking things to the dog every day, and they don't even realize it. And then you're going to, you know, simply counter condition and desensitize the dog to your approach, or to the dog's approach, or to the kid's approach when they've got guardable items. Make sure that you generalize, or you have the dog generalize to do that same exercise all over the place and with a variety of items. And then never forget that the dog is a resource guarder. Continue practicing the exercises, and just be cognizant of potential guardable items. So that's pretty much it for today. Oh, I left this picture. Well, I'm gonna leave it there. It's Vernon. So anyway, any questions about resource guarding? So you can pretty much modify all of these exercises to work with other dogs. If you read mine, and I'm pretty sure in Patricia McConnell. So mine is by Jean Donaldson, and Patricia McConnell has written some stuff, but I think it's mostly on her blog about resource guarding. And both of them say that, you know, some guarding with dogs is acceptable as long as nobody's getting hurt, but less so with people. Like if there's obvious guarding against people of items, that's more of a concern.
Like resource guarding humans or resource guarding against?
Yeah, resource guarding against humans.
My mom's resource guarding both of other dogs.
Oh, like,
Well,
oh, okay.
specifically, literally only
I thought you meant when people resource guard.
my
That could be a problem. Yeah, no, I mean, here, let me switch back. Let's stop my share. Okay. I don't know if you can see me, but yeah, so they basically say that when dogs are guarding against other dogs, it's you know, it's more acceptable to them. But if when dogs like show any overt signs of guarding towards people, like growling and stuff like that, that's something that they recommend working on. Any other questions?
I guess, Melissa, just a question. One of the things that I've seen is dogs resource guarding their like beds, so the human bed.
Does Mindy do that?
No, she doesn't do that. Sammy did it. He would resource guard, especially if I was in the bedroom on the bed and people would come in, he would like bark them and chase them out the bedroom. But I've also heard it happen, like another person in Australia, they got up and went to the toilet and the dog jumped on the bed. When they came back, the dog actually bit him.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I get, yeah. So would you just like teach the dog, you know, to get off the bed, I guess?
Yeah, definitely. Because, and I'm working on a case with that right now, with a dog who gets up on surfaces and bites people over that. And, you know, it's very important for people to rehearse, you know, moving the dog from place to place, you know, having dogs be on platforms and then rehearse getting them off of the platform, you know, teaching them things like Whatcha Got There works great for this too, because you train the behavior with like moving off. But you know, management is key too. Like if it's a real problem, you might weigh, you know, whether or not the dog has to stay on the bed, right? Because sometimes it's easier for people to manage the behavior than it is for them to treat it over a period of time.
Can I piggyback on something?
Yeah.
So, like, let's say you were to manage it by saying, okay, the dog is not allowed on the bed anymore. Would there be a concern that, like, if they ended up on, like, it might exacerbate?
Yeah,
because
that's
they don't have access.
right. Like if they get up on the bed, if you've been relying on management, and the dog gets on the bed, then you might be screwed because you haven't been practicing the other stuff. So of course it's a good idea to practice, you know, what to do when the dog's in that situation, right? Like you know, I'm seeing a dog now who, you know, the dog bites their people every single week, and it's always about the same thing. Like the dog is somewhere they shouldn't be, so somebody pushed the dog off. Yeah, and the dog bites them. Yeah, every single time. So part of it is, you know, teaching other ways of getting the dog off. Instead of telling the dog to get off the bed, you know, because that's different. It's a different approach. Like when people are like, oh, no, off, which I'm sure that you guys weren't doing with Sammy, but it happens all the time. And instead, you know, telling them, you know, a stationing cue or telling them touch was something that, you know, something that's something to do as opposed to something they shouldn't be doing. I don't know if this answered your question, Suzanne.
Yeah.
But yeah, it definitely can work in resting spots for sure. I mean, it's just, yeah, I mean, management is important, but like Emery reminded us, it's always important to practice, to counter condition, you know, approaches and change the dog's mind about how they feel. With Sammy, I mean, it could also be like, there could be also that fear aspect, right? Did he do it with Chris too, or was it, no, so like, that makes sense.
Wasn't it one of your friends, Suzanne, that you chased out?
Yeah. I mean, it's a weird one, isn't it? Because how many strangers do you have coming into your bedroom?
Yeah.
Apparently you have some.
Really, I do, like my mom, my dad, you know, when they come and visit. But he didn't do it so much with my mom, but he definitely did it with my dad.
And that's very interesting to me. So, you know, it really could be this whole trust variable was very important for him.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I think it's a pretty straightforward topic, but you know, I think it's a straightforward topic. There are simple exercises. I think the most difficult thing is the whole trust building thing, you know, kind of incorporating it into daily life, and then the whole like potential for the human to forget that the dog guards things. Those, to me, those are the most difficult parts of this kinds of cases. Okay, well, I guess if you guys don't have any more questions, feel free to request our next talk, something for our next talk. And we were also talking about maybe alternating these kinds of talks with watching a behavior video next week. So next week we can watch a video. I can post like different video options and we can vote about what we want to see.
Did they have a vote like on Facebook?
They do. We can do a poll option on Facebook and we can see what you guys want to watch.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Melissa.
Okay, thanks for coming.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.